Welcome to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Chandra Ghosh, Chief Scientific Officer of Emily's Entourage.
Hey everyone, my name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and we are very excited that you've joined us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. This morning, we're going to really get to cover the gamut with Chandra, talking about entrepreneur, academics, as well as patient advocacy foundations and the impact that patients can have on the drug discovery and development process. So we've got a lot to cover. Thank you to our partners at Mints for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. As a practical housekeeping matter, please ask your questions as we go through our conversation in the chat or the Q&A box, and Derek and I will get to them as we have our conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek to kick us off. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good morning, Chandra. Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to have you. Chandra is somebody who I have known for ages. She's been a fantastic scientist. She's been a wonderful New York entrepreneur and is now the Chief Scientific Officer of Emily's Entourage. So we can get into a whole host of things today. So Chandra, welcome. As you know, we love to kick off with an origin story. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about how you got where you are?
So I'll start from the very beginning because that's kind of my origin story starts. I grew up in Calcutta, India, and I came to the US for college and grad school. I was always very interested in infections and microbes and viruses because I kind of saw the gamut of all these, the benefits of vaccines and, benefits of antibiotics growing up. I say this story quite often. I've had quite a multitude of, I've had cholera from drinking tap water in school. I've had typhoid from having an ice cream, and probably one of the few people who has actually lived through a plague outbreak in the 1990s. But we just went to school with knee and socks in the heat, and that was pretty much it. But that kind of over my years of growing up in India, that piqued my interest in infections and microbiology, and I knew very early on that's what I would like to focus my career or my future, at least my education, because I was at high school at that point. On I came to the US, and after my undergrad in St. Louis University, I did my PhD at NYU, again in microbiology, and then moved to Boston, and I did probably the most fascinating 2 years of my career. I was a postdoc at MGH in the Department of Infectious Disease. And it was around that time there was, the beginnings of the C. diff outbreaks were happening in different hospitals. And we started working with a small company, I guess you could call it a startup at that point. Cambridge was very different 20 years ago, called a Cambis, and they were developing a toxoid vaccine for C. diff. So, that was my first foray, if you will, into biotech, or how do you take a product that you're testing in a lab, and what are the steps that you need to do before it reaches patients. So that was kind of my origin story into biotech, if you will, but from an academic point of view. So we did a little bit of work on C. diff vaccines. And then, after my postdoc, I moved back to New York. I joined David Ho's lab at Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center, which at that time was affiliated with Rockefeller. I wanted to work on vaccines, and, David Ho is known for his work in the HIV space. So we started working on, they were already working on HIV, and I kind of joined, but I kind of kept my focus on C. diff and, tried to develop that. And that was kind of, I guess my origin story into, where I started and kind of where I sort of ended up about 10, 12 years back.
Yeah, you just spent like 90 seconds over like 20 years. I feel like we definitely need to dig in a little bit here.
I mean, going to work with David is kind of like saying you want to play basketball with LeBron James, right? I don't know if everybody appreciates what a towering figure David is, but basically, if you use the words immunology and AIDS in a sentence, David is the next word in that sentence. He really was an absolute pioneer in that field and drove probably some of the most groundbreaking immunology science that is, impacted more patients than, you can keep score however you want, but David is absolutely at the pinnacle of immunology. So So let's kind of dig in there a little bit. I mean, you go and not only work with David, but you've got this interdisciplinary center. And so talk to us a little bit about what kind of things that you were doing, because this doesn't sound like, this is not kind of a standard, postdoc type of position. You're kind of in a very interesting place there.
Yeah, so Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center is a very interesting place to begin with. It was sort of independent, but always affiliated with universities. When it first started, it was strongly affiliated with NYU because it was, based across the street from Bellevue Hospital. And then at some point, I think in the mid to late 90s, that affiliation switched to Rockefeller. And then now, Aaron Diamond's affiliated with Columbia. So when I started working in Dr. Ho's lab, I've never called him David, but he knew my background was in, bacteriology. I had done my PhD on H. pylori, my postdoc on C. diff. He was really intrigued by all of that. And I told him, I don't know anything about HIV or viruses, but he wanted fresh eyes on the problem. And so that was really interesting. So, it was such an interesting lab. Although I wasn't involved, there were people, running clinical trials, at least phase 1 clinical trials out of the lab, because Rockefeller had a day hospital where patients could come, like healthy volunteers could come and, get vaccinated. So it was really interesting seeing, literally lab like bench to patient kind of transition, and what that took. So even sitting in a room for, I think I was there for 8 years, initially as a postdoc and then as a research scientist. You soak all of that in, like what is PKPD, like what is, what does efficacy look like? What does safety look like? We were always talking about clinical trials and patients, and we had really famous patients walk in through the lab. So it was a really meaningful and, really interesting 8 years. And, I, on the other hand, didn't work on HIV for very long, like maybe for the first couple of years, but I had a C. diff project, and we got an R01 grant for that. And then I kind of focused entirely on it. And, I was allowed to do that, which is, really fortunate for me. And, and people, like I would present in a, lab full of virologists, and, I would get really interesting takes from them. Dr. Ho was really interested in C. diff, and, and so it was very multidisciplinary, but also very, very translational. Like we never forgot the fact that, there were patients who were waiting for what we were doing. So that was, and that kind of has been also, I've kind of tried to look back and see if there's a common thread in my life. Every single person I've worked for has been an MD, but like a, working physician. Like my PhD was in Martin Blazer's lab, was the head of medicine at NYU, then, Ed Ryan at MGH, he ran the, the tropical medicine clinic at MGH. So really like, very much patient-focused research, like all throughout my life. So I think that's what's unique, I guess.
Yeah, you kind of didn't have any choice, huh? You were going to go keep doing something translational or disappoint everyone you ever worked with. So how did you go from out of Rockefeller, you worked on C. diff translationally, right? You worked with Symbiotic Health.
Yeah. So about 8 years in, I was kind of trying to think of what I could do next, but I knew it would be like something translation. Had never worked outside of academia. Right. And 2015, it's not like New York was the hotbed of biotech companies. It really wasn't. It's a very different place today. And we knew each other back then. Yep. And I really wanted, and I knew I wanted to live in New York City. My family lives here. And I kind of looked around and I wanted to make that leap, but I wasn't quite sure how to do that. And I also didn't know whether I would be any good at it. I've always been a bench scientist. Right. And, I thought like I'd look around and see what's out there. There was only one company, or a startup in New York City, and that was Symbiotic Health, that was working on C. diff, which was very fortunate because I had worked on C. diff pretty much the last 7, 8 years of my life at that point, or even longer. And at least I knew the science part wouldn't be, a huge burden, but like, I would learn a little bit about the business, like what it's like talking to VCs. What if I hated it? Like, or, could I even wrap my head around what a fundraising term sheet could look like, or what licensing would look like. So I joined Symbiotic Health, which was a startup run by Gerard Honig, and we were developing fecal microbiome pills for C. diff infections. And then that's how we started. That's the company I joined. And then I was there for about 9 months, so not very long, but it was, we did a licensing deal with Rockefeller, twin license, C. diff license from Vince Fichetti's lab, who I had known for many years before. And, I learned a lot of things, how to talk to VCs, what, slide deck could look like, what's confidential, how important IP is, and so on and so forth. So it was, 9 months of really interesting, learning. The learning curve was very steep, but, that was kind of my foray into, I guess, the biotech world, where I realized I don't mind talking to VCs.
Chandra, let me ask you this, because as you know, from being in our ecosystem for a while, we have a lot now of entrepreneurs, right? We have a lot of people that would like to take a path that was similar to yours. When you were still at Rockefeller, did you start sort of how did you start preparing to move out? Or did you literally go to Symbiotic Health and be like, oh, wow, I really want to invest in learning about the business process?
So it wasn't like either or, it was a little bit of both. I knew like programs were starting, even when I was at NYU, a few people from our lab was working with the tech transfer offices to kind of, I can't remember what the program was called, where they would expose PhD students to, licensing and doing due diligence and so on. I didn't really use that at Rockefeller, but I knew the tech transfer office very well. I knew Kathleen Dennis, and like, there were couple of people who have been like transformative for my life and my journey. One would be Kathleen Dennis, and two would be Chris Carapetian, but I'm sure we'll get to him in a bit. And, even for our own patents, right, I would have to go, talk to tech transfer, and I would see Kathleen, like, tell us the story, how it is, and why what we are planning on doing is useless or useful, and, kind of, you all know that. I love her to death.
Which was it mostly?
I love her to death, really. It was, so that was my only foray into, getting into like the biotech entrepreneurship world. And it was, and she was really, transformative. And like, I'm not like minimizing. I don't know if she's on the call or not, but
she is. Hi, Kathleen.
I didn't know she would be on the call. But I didn't really prepare myself for any of this. But once I formed the company, one of the things Kathleen asked me to do was actually join the ELAB program, which was, again, first I was like, oh my God, that's like, 6 months. But then I'm like so glad that I did it, because, I learned a lot. And made really meaningful connections there as well that changed the course of bioharmony as well.
So it's interesting. We've had Mary on the program before. She's excellent, and we've kind of extolled the virtues of eLabs before. But this is a little bit of a different question, right? So you've gone through eLabs. I think everybody thinks that eLabs is a really good experience, and there are other kinds of programs out there like that. So what are some of the things that an eLab does really well, and what are some of the things that it either kind of doesn't have enough time to do, or what are some of the things that you wish an eLab could do?
I wish, I mean, it's been a few years, but if I recall, it was maybe 6 weeks initially of classes, but it was like a day per week or something, which is a big time commitment for people who have full-time jobs. I understand that. But now in the virtual world, I wonder if you could expand that a little bit more, where it truly becomes a mini MBA, like, so, more content, if you will, and really we learned a lot about how do you make like a slide deck, right? We learned about IP, we learned about PLN, profit and loss sheets, which, I didn't ever really use, but we spent a lot of time doing. But we also learned, like, the sunflower model. Do you remember, like, Mary does this all the time, and I love it because it helps you think of like your core technology and all the different indications. And because it's such a cool, I've used it multiple times since then. But at that point I was like, oh my God, do we really have to draw a sunflower now? But, but it was really, that part, like, I think the content could be, increased, like with more, professors or, more like entrepreneurs, like, we did, like, there were different talks on competitiveness, competitive intelligence, IP. So all of that was good. But I think for me, at least, and for quite a few people, what was really meaningful were, getting like pharma, biotech, VCs in a room at that time. Like, again, New York in 2016 was very different. So getting, pharma in a room for even and one evening of, like, that speed dating thing that we used to do, like, where you'd pitch for 30 seconds and then, if they wanted to, they would come and speak with you. And that's where I met the Research Beyond Borders at Boehringer Ingelheim. So,
so that's good. So you did all of this kind of concurrently. You started BioHarmony, and so talk a little bit about that. Did you basically find, did you find an asset that you liked? What was the transition like, and what was it like to kind of step in and say, okay, I'm going to go, I'm going to start this other company over here? Because I met, Symbiotic Health was a really cool technology in a tough spot, because you were basically competing against, fetal microbiome transplant, which is incredibly effective and remarkably cheap, right? So it's actually a really difficult hill to climb.
It's a very difficult hill to climb. And we were also competing with a biotech that was based in Boston that had just raised $140 million. So it was.
Oh yeah, that also doesn't help.
So it was very, very difficult. And then we also knew there was a nonprofit, the Stool Bank in Boston. So it was very hard from a competitive point of view. Also, like, how do you monetize fecal transplants? And we've come a long way. Like Rebiotics, which is a Ferring company, just got a very favorable AdCom. I think it was last week or even earlier.
Yeah.
And so, again, we're in a very different space right now. But when I was and so the beginning, so I knew about Vince Fichetti's lab, where all these licenses were being developed at Rockefeller, because I spent hours in the animal rooms with someone from his lab who was also working on C. diff. So over hamster guts, we kind of connected. Over years, I gave a talk in his lab on C. diff because they were working on C. diff license. And I got to know Vince very well. I really liked their technology. Bacteriophage license as antimicrobials is, I think, a game changer, even though Contrafect, had a little bit of an issue with their phase 3. But if I had to bet, on a novel antimicrobial that with the right clinical trial, right indication, could really make a difference, even in the future, it would be phage license. So I knew all the work they were doing in the lab. So, when I was at Symbiotic Health, we licensed the C. diff license, but I knew I wanted to get into the gram-negative bacterial space because that's where the biggest unmet needs were. And I wasn't sure where the technology was, but, I knew, like, I would take some time and then go, speak with Vince, speak with other PIs in the antimicrobial space and see who was working on anything like this. It's a very difficult space to be in. So once I left Symbiotic, I went literally across the street to Rockefeller, and Vince said, we have this Acinetobacter license that, no one seems to want because it's a gram negative. And I was like, wow, give it to me. Can you? And then, then I went and spoke to Kathleen, and, and then the rest, as you say, is history. And, along the way, obviously, I met Chris Garabedian, who was a seed investor and, a mentor. And, he really did transform BioHarmony from, a scientist-led startup to something, to a company that had, relationships, like very strong partnerships with pharma. We really, took the license message as far as we could, talked about antimicrobial resistance as a problem. And then obviously, the pandemic happened, and then the XBI kind of ended up, where it was. It was really hard to raise funds for antimicrobials. It always is, but it's getting more and more difficult. So that's a tough space to be in.
It is a tough space to be in, and I think we'll come back to that in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about your work with Chris, right? So I mean, we've had Chris on this program. Chris has been fantastic in so many ways, and so you go and Chris, sees something in you, right? Because the way that Chris describes what he does is he says, I pick people who I think have a lot of talent and then try and get them to really kind of the next stage of the CEO and the leader that they can be, right? And I think just about anybody that talks to you about science or business realizes that you could be really good at it, right? I don't think you don't hide that fact terribly well. Like, it's pretty apparent pretty early. So what were your early kind of discussions like with Chris in particular? Like, when could you tell where he was impacting early enough, or did you have stuff that you needed to change? What were some of the early things that he did that were really valuable for you?
So I met Chris while he was transitioning out of Sarepta and before he had started ontogeny. So my first check to BioHarmony was actually a personal check from Chris. So I met Chris in a Midtown coffee shop, and I met him because a colleague of a colleague thought I should talk to him when I was starting BioHarmony because he might be interested. He's looking for really innovative things. Mm-hmm. And so he spoke to Chris, and then Chris was like, sure, I'll meet with her. And we met twice. And, we spent maybe 2-3 hours chatting about the science. We didn't talk about anything. We talked about the science. We talked about Vince. And I can't remember if one day, I'm sure he met Vince as well. He definitely met Kathleen. But the conversations that we had were completely focused on the science, like how strong the science was, and what I wanted to do with the science, and why do I want to do this? Like, he wanted to understand, like, I guess my origin story, like why I wanted to do this. And he was one of the few people I didn't have to introduce what Acinetobacter was, which was still a very random bacteria, even though since then it's like one of the top priorities, like a priority pathogen for the World Health Organization as well as the CDC. And one of the things he taught me very early on, because, even though I was starting a company, I still had that, curiosity about science and let's try this experiment and see where it takes us. And he was like, no. Very much focused on, because I would get curious. I'm like, what if we mix this with that and add this? He's like, just take that and take it to the patients as quickly as you can. And, and so he kind of taught me how to look for those key experiments and do those key experiments without getting distracted by, the what ifs, which is, it's hard to do if you're a scientist. It's hard to do because you got trained for 20 years to do that.
Right.
Look for, the next interesting, really query the science to see where it could take you.
Yeah. Well, it's a shift in approach, really. I mean, a fundamental approach to that scientific piece, right?
Yeah. So that was probably, I would say, Chris's biggest challenge with me, where, and I've kind of internalized it. Every time I would do an experiment, I'm like, would the FDA want to see this in their first, in our first meetings? And that's kind of how I focused myself. And he would always say, do the experiments that the FDA would want to see.
Yeah, no worries. But it is true. And for a science, it's funny for me as a lawyer, right? Who I whittle things down. My goal is to whittle things down to as few words or whatever. And I think there's probably a happy medium between how you would approach something as a curious scientist and how you approach something as the CEO of a company.
Yeah. So that was, so it was hard. That was probably the biggest challenge I also had initially. So I would say finding the kind of narrowing your focus down to where you need to go was, probably the biggest feedback I got from Chris, and also working back, this is where you want to be, and, what are the steps? So kind of thinking back to where you are. Yeah. And that was, obviously helped us with IP. He helped us with, talking to Boehringer Ingelheim for our, partnership deal. He was pretty much there at every step. And as, the Perceptive Ontogeny Fund grew, we had other folks on his team, like Fred Calori also like was at a lot of meetings with us. I interacted with him a lot. Heather Petty, who was also part of their team. Like, so the initial, like the original, like 3 or 4 folks at Jean Tajni were very much involved in what I was doing on a regular basis.
Yeah. I feel like there's a big difference between, 2015 and 2016 and now, whereas now you would probably be held up as like a founder-led biotech, and your Twitter account would be, we should support, younger scientist founders, et cetera, et cetera. That ethos, that wasn't there in 2016. Like there weren't any kind of positive vibes about any of that. It really seemed like all of it was, if you were a first-time CEO, you had to climb up this hill, and it's just like, it's hard out there. Good luck.
It was hard. And the sheer there's another anecdotal meeting that I love that, and whenever I see him, I kind of remind him of it. So one of, right after I met, or I licensed the technology, I met with Joel Marcus. One of my first pitches was to Alexandria, of all pitches. And I pitched for like a good hour, talked about every single Western blot and, all the animal data and stuff. And he, after like the meeting was done, and he's like, "Are you the CEO?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Don't show Western blots next time." Like probably like, he was laughing the whole time. He's like, "Fix your slides." And, but he was so on it, like for the next few months, like I would send him slides and he would be like, he would talk about things. So even, he didn't have to do it. He's, the head of Alexandria, like a real estate company, even though they had a fund. But, he was one of the first pitches I gave to, and I kind of think back to that when I see him. I'm like, remember when I showed you the Western blots? And
yeah,
he was probably blocked it, but
I do, he said wistfully, right? So.
In general, I would say like all the interactions were quite positive, even early on, even as a scientist CEO, and they kind of recognized, where I was coming from. So it wasn't like, get out of my office or anything. There was always a little bit of insight or guidance or something that most of these folks would give me. So
yeah.
Which is what you hope for, right? Particularly in a, we'll call it young ecosystem, right? At the time, you don't want, you want to encourage the development of the science, and therefore you need to encourage the development of the leaders, right? The leaders of those companies. I have a feeling that not everyone has exactly that experience. There may have been a few get out of my offices or along the way for people.
I didn't see it. But they may have told me that, but I also may have like glossed over that.
No, I think even though it was a hard environment, I think most of the people that were kind of on the front lines from the investment standpoint, most of them were, good and patient people. They didn't invest in a lot of deals, but if you went and sat with Tom Brennan or Carlo Rosito or whatever, they had patience for you. They were helpful. They were, it was not easy to get a deal done, but I don't really think there were many, if anyone, that wouldn't actually sit with you or would be so curt as to say, "Please get out of my office. Why would you even present this to me?" So at least it wasn't an easy environment to raise money in, but at least it had a level of support that I don't know would be standard somewhere else, right? You don't have kind of the Silicon Valley ethos or even kind of the Boston investment ethos. We had, I think we had a lot of good people that just weren't doing a lot of deals yet.
Yeah. And, in general, most of the interactions were positive. And I did go to a ton of Boston VCs as well. Not so much on the West Coast, but in general, they kind of knew where I was coming from. And, like they were really like curious about the science, and they knew the space was really difficult. So off the bat, I knew this would be a bigger hill to climb, but they were like, most of them spoke or, had, like pretty much everyone. And if they ever heard of anything or knew who would be a better contact, they were always helping, in general, like the whole, even like funds that I knew were, much more later stage funds, like the Arches of the world. But Brennan was very helpful and Kanan was helpful. Like all of these VCs were very helpful. So,
I think they realized that they were helping build the ecosystem too. And that is, I think everybody realized that, where, they genuinely wanted to be helpful, and most of them genuinely cared about, the future here, which is important.
Yeah. Also, the introductions were from Kathleen Dennis. So.
Well, yes. I mean, we can only cover so much about Kathleen in the next half an hour. We don't really have enough time to fully talk about how terrific she is. Okay, so why don't we shift gears slightly, and why don't we talk a little bit about Emily's entourage and how you got there. So let's flip it. Let's go from being an entrepreneur and a CEO to really kind of working on behalf of a really exciting organization. So give us a little background on Emily's entourage and how you got there.
So, I was developing antimicrobials. One of our main indication was a lysine that would be inhaled for pneumonia patients. And it was really hard to fundraise around this. So at some point, Chris and I sat down and he was like, what about, the CF indication? Can Acinetobacter be, is that a priority pathogen? Like, can you find out more and see if that's an indication? Because, the pricing structure is slightly different. You might, be able to fundraise better around that indication. Yeah. And I wasn't so sure about this. So I was like, who should I speak to? And Vince Fischetti, who's the, where the lab from which our technology was licensed, he had a grant from Emily's entourage. And so he was like, if you want to know about CF, let me connect you with Emily's entourage. And I actually met Emily via Zoom about a year or year and a half before I even joined Emily's entourage. And it was more about finding out about the CF patient population, what their needs were, because, from an outside perspective, CF equals Pseudomonas, right? And we weren't really developing anything for Pseudomonas, but like I spoke to her, we found out like staph infections are on the rise, and that's, a huge problem in the CF world, but there was not much, room for Acinetobacter infection. So that was my first introduction to Emily's entourage. And that was about a year before, I had thought of even, looking for a job. Along the way in that year, that was 2021, we made that difficult choice of, winding down BioHarmony. So we were looking for partners who would acquire our technology. And we have, can't talk much about this, but, we were in, talking to a company and who would be acquiring us. And I thought very naively that process would go very, very quickly. And so in I think September or October, I was like, oh, this is going to be done in the next few months. What will I do next? Yeah. Like, I can't not be without a job because that's what I don't like doing, and I need to know what I'm going to do next. And so both Vince Fischetti and David Pride, who's a friend of mine who actually did his MD PhD from the same lab, he also has a grant from Emily's entourage, and he kind of knew that I was also going to transition out of BioHarmony. So both of them were approached, I think, by a headhunter who was working for Emily's entourage, looking for chief scientific officers. And so they were like, hey, would you be interested? And I was like, well, I know Emily's entourage, like I know Emily, but from one conversation, I wasn't quite sure what Emily's entourage even did. So I spoke to the headhunter, and like he kind of gave me a very high level overview of what Emily's entourage did. And I was very curious because in one hand, like they were really focused on this huge unmet need of the final 10%, which is, in general, about 90% of CF patients respond to these amazing drugs called, made by Vertex, called modulators. But there's about 10% of these CF patients who, don't benefit from these modulators. Yeah. But in general, everyone thinks, CF has been taken care of. So right. There's a lot of parallels between CF, from that point of view, as well as antimicrobials, where the market, pressures aren't favorable. So that was really attractive. I also like the fact that, the whole, infections play a huge role in, the lives of CF patients. So I knew there was one part at least of the CF, field that I could, help, at least from a scientific point of view. And also at the same time, for the last 25 years, I've been focused on anti-infectives, vaccines, and so on. I've really taken the time to study like what else is out there, like gene therapy, stem cell research, cell therapies. So this also gave me an opportunity to kind of branch out and, really become an expert in at least, from an academic point of view, like on all these other technologies. So I joined Emily's Entourage in January, and it's really a very interesting nonprofit. Like I said, it's very innovative. It's it's developing. It's focused on the final 10%, and it was started in 2011 by Emily Kramer-Golinkoff and her mom, Liza. And, they had no background in fundraising or the sciences. Emily has CF, and she has, she's in the final 10%. And they basically started this organization that has given out millions of dollars in academic funding, and these academic labs have had close to like $40 million in follow-on funding. They've started a company in Philadelphia, gene therapy company, that was called Tally Therapeutics, and then it became Spirovant, with Roivant acquiring them, and then a Japanese pharmaceutical company. So they've had quite a few successes, and so it was really interesting joining Emily's Entourage, because I thought like I could really do something and be helpful in a way, and kind of look at the academic, the research space, and see where where the next therapeutics could come out of, and how we could accelerate that development, so the final 10% actually get some sort of therapeutic or cure in the next few years. So that's like the overarching goal. But that's not the only thing that EE does. What I find really interesting about Emily's Entourage is that we actually have a patient registry where folks that's probably the most innovative. I think that's the most interesting thing about Emily's Entourage. One of the most innovative things, that there is the patient registry is actually full of patients who have these, nonsense mutations, at least 1 or 2 copies of these nonsense mutations. And when companies come to, sponsors come to Emily, they have access to this registry through us. So we allow, we find out what these, clinical trials are. If they benefit the final 10%, then we send out emails to the patients on these registries, informing them and, kind of giving them the power to kind of reach out to their centers, their medical centers, and ask to be put on these clinical trials. Because if there's one thing, that has really stood out about the CF patient population, is like how educated and in the know they are about the science, the technology, and how how much they want these clinical trials to come to them. So it's really empowering the patients to advocate for themselves.
How, so obviously you lead the scientific efforts, but how does Emily's Entourage reach patients so that they even know about the registry and in that potential avenue?
So, so a lot of folks do know, at least in the US, about Emily's Entourage, but we haven't really made, a serious effort, like, an active effort into reaching out to all patients and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think as the patient registry grows, we're going to make a bigger outreach into patients, to physicians, to kind of, the strength of the registry is the patients, right? So yeah. The more people we get on this registry, the more the companies know where to go to find these patients in the rare disease space, which is difficult to begin with. And so we're going to start making a real push into finding, and reaching as many patients as we can, having them sign up for the registry, and right now about 2/3 of the patients on our registry are based in the US, and 1/3 are, ex-US. So, expand internationally and, reach as many patients as we can, because, that way we can direct where the companies can go to set up their sites and, bring clinical trials to them.
Yeah. I think one of the most exciting things to me about Emily's Entourage is, I think it is emblematic of really how there's another voice in the innovation spectrum now. I mean, if you wound the clock back 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it was, and you told everyone that, we could cure 90% of cystic fibrosis, we now have a thing that's going to, help them live long, productive lives. Everyone from the venture industry to biopharma would be like, that's great, right? And then they would probably deprioritize every other thing that they were going to do in CF because it was 90% done. Yeah. And now, it doesn't matter how big the patient population is. It matters that the people around the patient population want their voice to be heard, they want people to care, and they want science to move forward, and they can mobilize ways of doing that. And that to me is, I think that's one of the biggest things to have happened in the last 10 years. And it's not even, I can't even pick kind of a singular event that made it happen. But the fact that now these patients and these patient groups with enough, motivation can have a voice and can really kind of be part of that. And I think that's, I think that's amazing on several different levels. And I don't know how it came about, but I'm very, very happy that it did, because it means that patients don't have to sit on the sidelines and wait for someone else to do something anymore.
Yeah, and patient advocacy groups across the board, and not just Emily's entourage, but in every rare disease, and even in non-rare diseases, can play a huge role. Like whether it's talking to sponsors, talking to regulators, bringing attention to the diseases and the lives and how folks are living with these diseases. It's so much that patient advocacy can do, and and Emily's entourage is pretty much in all of those spaces. We actually had a survey like that came out in 2021 and was published this year, where it queried the last 10%, like what do you need, right? What do patients need, right? We could sit here and be like, okay, they need X, Y, and Z, but where is that patient voice? So that survey was really meaningful. Like, and I think the biggest take home message from this final 10% was that they're really excited that 90% of the CF world has modulators, has treatments, is now living, a transformed life. But at the same time, like, that final 10%, it's like, like, I hope, and, I hope they're listening. Like, I hope, they know that, we're not taking our eyes off that problem at all. And, there will be cures for them as well in the near future. So I thought that survey was really meaningful as well. And what the data we got from that, like the mental health aspects of these patients, the financial burdens on the last 10%. And the other thing to think about, although, the last 10%, that could be a couple of thousand patients, but it's 40, like anywhere between 20 to 40% of that patient are minorities. So this also enhances or shows how health disparities are, like inequities are playing out even in the CF rare disease world. So there's a lot more work to be done.
And sure. I think from a policy sort of access perspective, we're also seeing companies that focus on rare disease start to talk to each other more, talk to policymakers. I was on a panel last week in Washington, D.C. That was pulled together in part by the Rare Disease Company Coalition, right? So I think all of these things take time, but I think they're elevating the patient voice, and that's, and that's what's important, because we also, when you find cures and treatments for the last 10%, you also want them to be able to get to patients and for patients to have access to them.
Absolutely. And, that's obviously, very important, like the costs and, how, like, and the ease of using these treatments, right? If you have to go and, if you have jobs, like if you have to go for, let's say a gene therapy, treatment, like every week or so for one day at a center that is 200 miles from your home, that becomes very burdensome. So all of those are like, up front and center when we are thinking about, what's going to be the transformative, therapeutics coming down the pipeline. And I absolutely agree with you. Like, we also now realizing that, given that CF is, becoming lower and lower in the priority list of, companies that are doing, for example, gene therapy, we are looking at companies, and we call these the pathfinder diseases, like parallel diseases. If it gets solved for, one genetic, can you translate that to CF? And, so we know that's absolutely the case. And, we're also looking at, parallel indications, parallel diseases, to see if we fund that, can that be translated into, CF, so that, CF is at least on that list of indications for these companies.
Kind of beyond the therapeutic piece, the actual logistic piece of, how do you get care? How do you get there? How often is it? Where do you go? How do people make that work? Because, like a lot of things, these are mostly kids, right? So you have parents and caregivers that need to get them there. You can't just throw your kid in an Uber to go to a medical center 200 miles away to go get treatment. So these are actually big things that are going to need to be solved for, a whole host of diseases. So I'll ask you, so how does that, being kind of a part of what I'll call the larger constellation of, rare diseases, right? When you go out and you're talking to folks about Emily's Entourage and about what you're doing, you're really not only speaking for Emily's Entourage or for CF, you're actually kind of a representative of, an entire, host of patients that all need solutions like this.
Yeah, so that, I would say, like, the final 10% is just, an example, right? Like if we have discoveries and, major breakthroughs in the final 10%, that could be translated to Duchenne, that could be translated to many Friedreich's ataxia, like any of these, rare diseases that have no therapeutic options at this point. Very much aware of that. And so I actually think this cross-pollination of science and research and development is absolutely essential moving forward, especially as we're going into this genes therapy, cell therapy, kind of more novel technologies.
Yeah. So when do you go ahead, Jennifer?
Oh, I was just saying, so how do you, when you're thinking about grants, right? How do you identify researchers or companies that you're going to work with that are thinking the same way as you, that aren't solely focused, that have a broader view?
So when I joined earlier this year, what year is this? Earlier this year, one of my first charges was to look at develop a roadmap. So that was, talking to scientists and biotech companies, large companies, regulators, all of them, and seeing what the biggest need was, where do we see the research and development going? And we identified about 6 areas, therapeutic areas, where we could be, where if we give out funds would be really meaningful and we could actually, make a difference. And so they were like, gene therapy was one of them. I'll just give you a few examples. Staph infections was one of them. Gene delivery, huge, like any kind of delivery technologies, So, for example, Spirovant is an viral vector delivery company. So we are focusing on non-viral technologies because that's, lagging a little bit, but obviously with Moderna's, vaccine, like the lipid nanoparticle space is taking off. So so once we identified these areas, we had a request for proposal that we announced, I think it was mid-May, and I went to pretty much one conference and kind of spoke to scientists, but this was all in the CF space, and where we talked about the need for them to kind of work together, apply for these grants. So we know where the biggest innovation's happening. As we move forward, we know we have to go to these pathfinder diseases. So we actually have a conference that EE will be hosting next year. We don't really have the dates quite yet, but sometime in May, based on gene therapy in Philadelphia, which is, the hotbed of the birthplace of gene therapy. And, we plan on inviting folks who aren't in the CF space, but, it's, whether it's in like retinal diseases, whether it's, in Duchenne, we want them to come and talk to each other, talk about, their research. We're going to highlight the scientists that we funded and see if there's, cross-pollination, see if they can work together and, move the space forward. And, maybe when they're sitting, in their lab meetings and thinking about an indication that's not related to CF, but, something might come to their minds and, and they might think of ways to address the CF problem as well. So, that's our next, big thing that we have planned for the new year. And, we're always looking for companies. We're always evaluating companies that maybe CF is not the main indication, it's second or third down, but, we would be happy, we'd look to fund those if we think they're innovative enough to move the CF indication forward.
Yeah.
So,
So when are some of the clinical readouts planned? Do you know when you're looking forward to on some of the stuff that's in the clinic?
So there's some really interesting RNA. Vertex has a mRNA treatment coming down the pipeline. I don't think they've started the trial yet, but those kind of things are, I feel the next couple of years are going to be really transformative. Like there's really interesting things coming down the pipeline as we move away from the small molecule, like the modulators, to more of the gene therapy, gene repair, or, mRNA-based technologies. So we're still a few years away, but, those are the things that I'm kind of looking forward to see as you know, like the FDA is ramping up, the hiring in that space because, they're going to be getting quite a few interesting things. And it's not just in the CF space, obviously. We're looking at, what else is happening across the, gene therapy, rare disease world as well.
I think there's an entire movement of that segment of the industry where we're looking at everything that goes into the equation around what a potentially curative therapy would look like. And that's something that hasn't really existed, or has only really started to exist now, but it certainly isn't normal, right? And it kind of upends the way that we think about a lot of things. It upends the way that we think about paying for it. It upends the way that we think about delivering it. And even it upends the way that we think about, how patients, deal with it and change their lives afterwards. So I think a lot of things like that are, changing for the better. And I think there's a lot of efforts devoted to, how do we make that happen? And the fact that we're now really listening to people, the fact that you did a survey like that, the fact that we're listening to people and thinking about what is it that you, the patients, actually need, what is important to you, I think that signifies a pretty big shift in how those things are happening.
Absolutely. And, one piece of that puzzle is obviously the regulators, right? Like, how do we explain to the regulators, like, what the need for these rare disease patient populations are, right? Like, it's going to be very different from, when the modulators were approved for a bigger number of patients, so, bringing, like in a way, educating them or bringing the viewpoints of the patients, whether it's through a listening session or coming with a sponsor and kind of putting forward, the patient perspective is absolutely important. And I think it's critical now. I mean, I think the stage has been set where, that is almost becoming the new norm because the patient voice is very, very important.
And what advice would you give to other patient advocacy organizations, right, that were patient founded, that are thinking about how to add scientists, right, to their teams? How would you advise that they go about sort of thinking about that process?
I mean, my connection to Emily's entourage came from the labs that they funded, right? Like, so, maybe reach out to, if they do academic funding, reach out to those PIs and see if there's anyone in their lab or anyone they know in, that environment, because they're already passionate about that space, right? So, so I think that's the key, like finding someone very passionate about taking drugs to patients, right? Like whoever that, whatever the makeup of that patient is, that should be like, one of the key pieces that, folks should look for when, hiring, whether it's a scientist or CEO, whatever it is, to actually fill that role, because without that passion, it is, it's not gonna work. So I think reaching out to academic labs, reaching out to, people in that space already, probably you can find folks there.
Yep. So we've got about 7 minutes left. So I want to kind of stick with the thread of what you're doing and you're thinking really around the space of what else can we tackle, right? Which is funny because you started on your entrepreneurial journey of, listen, only think about the data that the FDA is going to want to see. Don't think about anything else. Now you've kind of come full circle. Now you've kind of said, okay, well, there's a whole bunch of these other problems that are going to need to get fixed if we're actually going to move this ball here. How do we actually fix this other stuff that people are only starting to think about?
Yeah, so it's kind of, wearing both hats. Like when I speak to academics, again, like, our goal is to fund research that can reach patients in the near to midterm. So still in the, very much focused on the Chris Garabedian way of thinking, where you do the essential experiments. How can we connect you with the folks who have the reagents or resources that you need, whether you have the best in vivo data, but you may not know how to, test that in vitro or whatever. If you have in vitro data, let us connect you with the folks who have the cells or the animals that, would be relevant for your indication. You might have, amazing science, in the Duchenne space, but you have no idea how to take it to, into the CF indication. We connect you with scientists in the CF indication. And we've already done that, and we're continuing to do that and connecting folks to each other and funding labs that are, bringing, technology from one lab to another lab that has the, resources for that next step of development. So development is still very much front and center to what we're doing.
So how do you think about how to phrase this? So how do you think about kind of the patient rights and things like that in terms of their data? Like you've put together this registry that is incredibly valuable, right? And how do you think about that in terms of, you know, what other than the actual therapeutic, where is the win for the patients, right? Imagine, you know, something gets developed and there's like really high out-of-pocket costs. How do you think about the other half of the patient equation after the drug gets developed? Do you need any sort of either assurances? Is there any kind of deal that you guys help drive when things go into clinicals, or is it literally just you are building something for our patients and we want to make it so that you have the best chance of success?
I mean, so far that's, you know, your second point is where we are. Like, we're just going to build stuff and then hope like the regulators, CMS, someone plays a bigger role in figuring out the pricing, because, you know, we all agree, like, you know, these medicines are very, very expensive and, you know, sometimes out of reach of like many of the patients who need them, right? And we see that. And I think as we move forward into the gene therapy space, where we know the, you know, cost of the drugs are going to be 10 times higher, even more than even the modulators, which are also expensive, there has to be, some take, like, you know, right now the most expensive drug is what, $3 million out there, not for CF, but, you know, whether it's vouchers or, you know, state help, or, you know, whether it's patient advocacy, we haven't quite played that role yet.
Yeah.
I'm sure as these more expensive drugs come down the pipeline, we probably will.
We actually, at tomorrow's annual meeting, we have a panel that's going to talk about sort of the potential, like the opportunities and challenges at looking at high cost therapies and how we pay for them. Yeah. Basically what the policy around that is, right? And can states start alternative payment models? What does the federal government do about that? So we're going to go down that path tomorrow. So,
awesome.
So stay tuned. Maybe we'll solve it all tomorrow for everyone.
Yep. Why not?
Well, and just in case if anyone needs a reminder of where the link is to register for the annual meeting, I have now put that in the chat.
So
sorry, Chandra, that was a softball right at the end.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Just like, thank you, Chandra. That was a nice layup.
Good segue.
So yeah, so in the 2 minutes we have left, let's actually shift back and let's why don't you leave the audience with where you think the New York biotech ecosystem is and sort of where it's going.
I think, you know, I've seen a huge change since, you know, 2015, 16. The biggest change is obviously access to wet lab space. Like when I started, it was just Harlem Biospace, which was so transformative at that point, right? Like you got a desk or a bench, you had a place to like receive your cells or whatever. You had someone who would write you a letter so you could actually apply for an SBIR grant, right? So that, you know, that problem, I think, has been solved, relatively speaking. You have Alexandria, you had J Labs, you have New York, you know, Biolabs, and so on. And there's multiple more that are coming up, and in different, you know, stages. Like you can rent one bench, which is what I did at Launch Labs, Alexandria Launch Labs. You can have a whole room, you can have a whole floor. So as companies grow, you know, I think from a space perspective, that seems to be addressed. Where I still think there's a bigger need is how do you hire or get folks to come to New York at the more higher mid to, you know, C-suite kind of like CEOs, CSOs. I mean, the science is here. That's not an issue. We've seen those graphs comparing Boston, New York, where all the NIH funding is, where the technology, and then, you know, there might be like technology coming out of, you know, the amazing academic institution, and then they'll just disappear and like end up in Boston or, you know, or San Francisco or Delaware or wherever there's
stop talking.
or wherever, right? Philadelphia. But I think, I don't know how to solve that issue because, you know, obviously New York is an expensive place to be in. Schools are difficult to get into and so on and so forth. So how do we grow up our own, you know, folks who love being in New York are from New York, so you don't have to kind of, and we're seeing a little bit of that, right? Like we're seeing a little bit of that starting up. And this is, you know, what we saw in Boston like 20 years ago. So, you know, hopefully that'll accelerate and, you know, and we can grow the companies here.
I think it will. I think it's coming. I do think it just takes time. But and speaking of time, unfortunately, we are out of it this morning. So Chandra, thank you so much. This conversation, we could have kept going. We really appreciate your sharing not only your expertise, but your time and thoughtfulness with us this morning. So thanks everybody for joining us. See you at the annual meeting tomorrow and next Tuesday at our breakfast.
Have a great day, everybody. Bye now.
Thanks.